I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, further to news from the battlefront and beyond, we look at Putin's decision to mobilise a record number of men, and what that means for the prospects of a meaningful ceasefire. Then, in a special interview, I talk to one of the men involved in some of the most important decisions made by the Biden administration during the war.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 1st of April, 3 years and 37 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined on the podcast by Ambassador Mike Carpenter, former Senior Director for Europe of the United States National Security Council. But first, the latest military and political updates from Europe and beyond. Last night was the quietest Ukraine has experienced in 2025, with Russia refraining from launching a large-scale drone attack for the first time in many months. The Ukrainian Air Force said it shot down 2 missiles launched by Russia, but no drones. Given the number of the latter fired at Ukraine regularly exceeds 150, this is worth noting, though we should be cautious to read too much into this and any correlation with the remarks of President Trump that we reported yesterday. After all, as we've seen many times before, at times Moscow is simply building capacity for a larger attack in a few days' time. I should add that despite the quieter night, Kyiv has accused Moscow of launching an attack on energy infrastructure in Kherson, with Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha saying 45,000 residents had been left without power. That would violate the proposed energy infrastructure ceasefire supposedly in place, although as we've seen in the past few days, that notion is thin at best. On the ground, we understand Russia is concentrating its main offensive efforts on the Pokrovsk sector in Donetsk, but, according to sources and observers, is stalling there, with Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi saying yesterday that the Russians were failing to advance, claiming that 7,000 Russian soldiers were killed near the town in January alone. In February, as you'll recall, the situation near Pokrovsk somewhat stabilised, with some saying that from what once looked like an extremely vulnerable position, the Ukrainians have managed to potentially secure the town for many more weeks, perhaps months. A source I spoke to painted a chaotic picture for the Russians this week, with troops cut off and the Air Force blowing up the dam behind those forces in an attempt to destroy a supply road and damage Ukrainian logistics, although actually having the opposite effect. Now, I hesitate to use a word akin to victory for Kyiv in this context. The fact remains that strategically, though, the Ukrainian armed forces have managed to avoid a collapse on that front, which was widely predicted in the latter half of 2024, alongside, of course, predictions of many energy blackouts over the winter. Another fate the country managed to avoid. But it is important to, whilst not forgetting these relative successes, recall that Russian troops continue to push across the lines, with some signs, according to the ISW and others, that recently troops have advanced along the Sumy-Kursk Oblast border amid that continuing effort to push Ukrainian forces from Kursk. Likewise, there have been some small progress in the past 24-48 hours in the Kupiansk direction east of Kharkiv. In the south, as Dom talked about yesterday, there are also signs of some marginal gains near Toretsk and Liman. But I think the most significant military news of the past 24 hours is that Putin has ordered 160,000 men to be drafted into the Russian army by mid-summer. A record high conscription drive, suggesting he is planning to boost ranks after months of sustained losses in trying to expel the last of Kyiv's troops from Kursk and in its slow grind forward into Ukraine's east. Just for context, that is up from 150,000 in 2024, 147,000 in 2023, and 134,500 in 2022. Though, apparently, the forthcoming draft campaign is in no way connected with the special military operation in Ukraine, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. It may be April Fool's Day, but we're not that gullible, Vlad. Try harder. It will be interesting to see whether there is any reaction from the US to this news. Hardly a sign that the Russians are preparing for a ceasefire. Again, after our broadcast yesterday, Trump threatened to impose secondary tariffs on Russia if it didn't make a deal to end the war. He said, "I want to see him make a deal so that we stop Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers and other people from being killed. I want to make sure that he follows through, and I think he will. I don't want to go secondary tariffs on his oil, but I think, it's something I would do if I thought he wasn't doing the job." Now, interestingly, the Russian press seem less convinced that his threats are real. As the BBC's Steve Rosenberg highlights, one paper there is dismissing Trump's threat because of the impact on global oil prices. A US president in a temper is capable of many dumb things, they say, but not of damaging his own country. Now, propagandists in Russia are also wading into the significant news that Marine Le Pen, leader of the French party National Rally, has been banned by the courts from public office for 5 years, potentially wrecking her hopes of becoming president in 2027. Her party is seen as being less hostile to Moscow, so we shouldn't be surprised the Kremlin would be happy, though one can't help but laugh at their faux outrage that the court's decision violates democratic norms. This from a country which imprisons and murders its political opponents. I'm talking about Russia, not the French at the time of the French Revolution. You know it's going to be good when occasionally sober Dmitry Medvedev posts, and he hasn't disappointed. He said, "After today's court ruling, it seems that only Russian Cossacks can restore freedom to France like they did on March 31st, 1814. Whether it won't be too late for Marine Le Pen is another question." So I wasn't expecting him to get into the Napoleonic Wars. As an aside, many of you will have heard that the origin of the French word bistro comes from the Cossacks in Paris in 1814. Allegedly, they used to shout bistro quickly to be given places to eat. It's not true, according to etymologists. So sorry to shatter another myth one often hears about Russian influence in Europe. But returning to the subject of deals, the Ukrainians, for obvious political reasons, are not dismissing the latest draft of the minerals proposal. They're also denying any plans to hold summer elections if a ceasefire were to happen, something The Economist reported yesterday. Their priority at the moment is trying to shore up European support, with some significant developments today, best summarised by the Kyiv Independent. The Weimar Plus group announced it will increase aid while considering additional sanctions on Russia to pressure Moscow into a ceasefire. Foreign ministers from Spain, Germany, France, Italy, Britain and Poland, along with EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, called on Russia to agree to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire on equal terms and with full implementation. Kyiv also received the latest instalment of the International Monetary Fund's budget support, amounting to $400 million, and the Netherlands allocated €2 billion to support Ukraine this year, which will include $500 million for Ukraine's drone line project, something we've discussed in an episode last month. Sweden will also provide Ukraine with a military aid package worth almost $1.6 billion, the largest tranche of military assistance since the invasion. But Russia's allies too continue to do their bit. China remains one of the key sellers, of course, of vital military components to Moscow, and Beijing's foreign minister, who is in Moscow today, has underscored that China and Russia are, to quote him, friends forever, never enemies, and that China is ready, surprise, surprise, to play a constructive role in ending the war in Ukraine, but backs Russia defending its interests. It comes as China has depicted Taiwan's president as a cartoon insect while launching large-scale military exercises around the island to serve as a stern warning and powerful deterrent against the island's independence. Now, one final story connected to that. suggests that despite the Washington Post reports that Taiwan's protection remains a priority for Washington, there is genuine concern in the Pacific among US allies about Trump's seemingly erratic policy making, with Japan and South Korea meeting with the Chinese to hold their first economic dialogue in 5 years, seeking to facilitate regional trade as the Asian export powers brace themselves against Trump's tariffs. It's noteworthy, I think, that Beijing state media promoted the idea afterwards that the three countries agreed to jointly respond to the tariffs, an assertion Seoul called somewhat exaggerated, while Tokyo said there was no such discussion. That should be perceived, I think, as an attempt by China to drive a wedge between those countries it would traditionally see as its rivals in the region and Washington. So an interesting development. Lots for us to get into there as we wrap up the daily news reports with our guest. And it is a pleasure and an honour to welcome to the podcast today Ambassador Mike Carpenter, former Senior Director for Europe of the United States National Security Council. That's the team used by the President for consideration of national security, military and foreign policy matters. That means that Ambassador Carpenter was in the room for many important White House decisions relating to President Biden's conduct of the war. Previously, he served as US Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the same administration, and before that was a career officer with the US Foreign Service, where he served as Deputy Director of the Office of Russian Affairs and Political Affairs and advisors on regional conflicts in the Office of Caucasus Affairs and Regional Conflicts. He served overseas in the US embassies in Poland, Slovenia and Barbados. Ambassador Carpenter, welcome to Ukraine the Latest. It's great to have you. I think it makes sense for us to start on the latest developments and the negotiations taking place between Washington and Ukraine and, of course, between Moscow. Where do you want to start on this subject? Do you believe that these talks are likely to lead to some kind of breakthrough, or that, in a sense, we're going through a process that will lead to a continuation of the status quo? Welcome.
Well, thanks, Francis, and it's great to be with you. In terms of the negotiations, look, I've always been pessimistic that the Trump administration can achieve what they claim they wanted to do, which is solve the conflict in a matter of 24 hours, or at least quickly in the early months of their administration. I wish I wasn't a pessimist. I would very much like for a lasting ceasefire or armistice to take place and to set in, because obviously that would stop the killing, which is what President Trump says he wants to do. All of us want that, and Ukrainians first and foremost. But the reason why I'm pessimistic is because I just simply don't see any overlap between Putin's interests and Ukraine's interests. And Putin's interests have remained maximalist throughout the course of this war, over 3 years now. And in recent days and weeks, he hasn't shown that he's willing to budge from those maximalist demands one iota. So I just don't see that the fundamentals line up here for some sort of a lasting deal. Perhaps a short-term ceasefire, 30 days, perhaps something more limited, energy infrastructure or freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, which might actually give Russia an advantage, but not a lasting peace deal.
Well, many listeners will certainly agree with you on that. And I wonder then how you would assess the White House's approach to these talks over the last few weeks and months, because it does seem, doesn't it, that they have taken a different, perhaps, viewpoint on the idea that Putin seeks maximalist objectives. They seem to believe that he wants an end to the war.
Well, that is, I think, a fundamental misreading of Vladimir Putin, if that is, in fact, their view. However, I question also, how they're approaching these negotiations and whether it's the right course. In fact, I think it's not the right course, because the Trump administration thus far has applied all of its leverage, and the United States has enormous leverage, both in terms of the headroom that it could impose sanctions on Russia with, but also in terms of what it can do to cut off important support, military support, intelligence support for Ukraine. So far, the Trump administration has used all of its leverage with Ukraine and almost no leverage at all with Russia. In fact, if you listen to the interview that Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, gave to Tucker Carlson, you see that, in fact, the Trump administration, at least in the person of Mr. Witkoff, is giving Putin a pass, saying that he's a nice guy, that he liked him, that he carried out legitimate referenda in the occupied territories, which we all know is a sham. So giving life to Putin's narrative and then cutting off critical intelligence and military support to Ukraine to get them to the table, that's going around about this entire negotiation from a backwards perspective. It should be the opposite. There should be much more leverage applied to Russia and support for Ukraine to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position to go into future talks. That's not what they're doing.
Do you think this is ideological from this White House, or do you think that this is just a profound misreading of what Russia is and a sort of ignorance there? Or do you think it is a relationship of sorts that's forged between Trump and Putin?
Well, the latter I can't really speak to because I don't know. What I can say is that the Trump administration has pursued a series of different policies that suggest, and I'm talking here about the statements about incorporating Greenland into the United States, taking over the Panama Canal, making Canada the 51st state. Those are not jokes. Those are not laughable statements. Those are very concerning statements in the year 2025 and suggest that the administration has a spheres of influence ideology or mentality, if you wish, that colors its worldview and how it perceives actors in all parts of the world. And if Mr. Trump thinks that the United States is entitled to a sphere of influence in its quote unquote near abroad in places like Greenland or Panama or Canada, then it would stand to reason that he would accept Putin's claims that he has a legitimate sphere of influence on Russia's periphery in what he calls the near abroad, meaning in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Georgia, in Moldova, and similar places. So that to me is very worrying. And again, it's not just that I'm interpreting what they're saying. This is sort of what came out of the mouth of Steve Witkoff in a published interview where he talked very clearly about President Putin in positive terms. And I find that very troubling and worrisome.
There's so many subjects, Ambassador, that I'm keen for us to get into, not least the decisions made during the Biden presidency that you witnessed, the future of the US-Europe relationship. But just to draw on a couple of big stories this week, I spoke earlier on about Taiwan and China. And there are, of course, these reports in the Washington Post this week that there is sincerity in the White House plan to try and support Taiwan and see China as the great threat. Do you, though, think, given the remarks that we've seen over the last few months, that realistically the United States would go to war in the Pacific if Taiwan was threatened in the way that many would think now Beijing is inclined to do?
Well, I can't give you an answer to that question because I don't know what this administration would do in that scenario. They are so erratic and so difficult to predict. There are obviously folks who serve in this administration in fairly senior positions who have staked their careers, or at least the last 10 years of their careers, staking out positions that are very hawkish on China and suggesting that the U.S. should absolutely go to war to preserve Taiwan's independence. But would President Trump actually do that if push came to shove? I don't know. I think a war to defend Taiwan would be unpopular in the United States. I don't know that it would be any more popular than war in Ukraine and defending Ukraine's ability to preserve its sovereignty and territorial integrity. In fact, I'm dumbfounded that some people think that somehow there would be enthusiastic support for the defense of Taiwan if it's not there for Ukraine. Although we can come to this, but I do think there is still a majority of Americans who support defending Ukraine. So I actually don't think that that's the case when we're talking about Ukraine. Look, President Trump, as you'll recall in his first term, when it came to his policies with North Korea, initially articulated a series of views and made statements that were very bellicose and very aggressive. He talked about fire and fury and suggested that there was a possibility that military hostilities could even commence with North Korea. In the end, he ended up hosting a summit with Kim Jong-un, whom he called his best friend, somewhat sarcastically perhaps, but nevertheless hosted a summit that gave a huge platform on the world stage to Mr. Kim and got really nothing out of it. And so that 180-degree turn in terms of foreign policy suggests to me that something similar could happen with the U.S. policy towards China in the coming years, where an initially very hawkish position could lead to a summit meeting and some sort of declaration of truce. I wouldn't exclude that possibility, but of course I can't predict. I don't have a crystal ball and don't know where this administration will ultimately end up.
Interesting, thank you. And just, as I say, one more question on the big news of the last sort of week or so, which is, of course, this Signal Gate, how one would best articulate it, this scandal involving a journalist invited into the Signal chat and these very, very senior officials, including the vice president, being part of this group. As somebody who, of course, worked at such a high security level, Ambassador, what was your response to that incident? And do you think there should have been resignations over it? Would there have been resignations over it during the Biden administration?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, my reaction was just utter shock at how this could possibly happen. I mean, I don't even want to hazard a guess as to how many meetings I convened in the White House Situation Room as senior director for Europe, where at my level, I chaired meetings with other senior officials, sometimes on weekends when there was an exigency or emergency, sometimes in the evening, sometimes early in the morning, at all different times of day, depending on the circumstances and what was happening. When we're talking about using force against a foreign country, that's a big deal. Any conversation that goes to, frankly, to cabinet members is a big deal. And so for them to sort of discuss this on Signal and not take the short trip with their chauffeurs into the White House complex to discuss this in the White House Situation Room, it's just mind-boggling why they wouldn't do that. There's a special purpose-built facility that's there just for that, so that they can gather and have these conversations. Anyone in the world can be looped into that Situation Room using communications and can participate in the meeting, even when they're on an aircraft. So, it's really crazy that this would happen, and especially the types of information that were divulged, attack plans and so on and so forth, with specific times and information on targets and their whereabouts. It is really shocking.
Well, this brings us neatly then into the subject I'm most interested in hearing your perspective on, which is the decisions made during the Biden presidency and what you witnessed there that you are able to relate. Perhaps first of all, before we get into specific moments, incidents, decisions, can you just paint a picture of your involvement in the Biden administration? What was the levels of the decisions that you were privy to? What kind of conversations were you having with the president? And then we can talk about specific historical moments.
Sure. So as you referenced in your opening, from late 2021 until the spring of 2024, I was ambassador to the OSCE, where I had a very different role. But when I came back to serve as senior director at the National Security Council in the spring of 24, I was essentially the focal point for meetings on the Russia-Ukraine war, coordinating at my level all of the various decisions that needed to happen regarding security assistance, regarding energy infrastructure support and protection, regarding humanitarian assistance, and any number of other policy issues. And I was also in the room for the meetings at more senior levels, including what we call the Deputies Committee meeting, which is a meeting of deputy cabinet members, and the Principals Committee meeting, which is what you just alluded to in our previous conversation, where cabinet members are gathered together to make the most critical decisions. And then finally, Because of my longstanding relationship with President Biden, I was often in the Oval Office with him when he made some of these decisions, or at least when he sought out more information in order to be able to make a decision on the key issues regarding the war.
So the invasion happens. President Biden is widely believed now to have taken the approach of, we want, of course, Kyiv to stand, we want it to survive, we want to deliver a blow for the Russians, but we need to be very, very careful. We need to be cautious because there is a danger of nuclear escalation and a broader, perhaps, conflict in Europe. Is that your reading of President Biden's mentality towards the war in the early phases, or are there nuances that are underappreciated?
Yeah, I think there are probably some nuances here. So I would differentiate the pre-February 22 period, when the administration had exquisite intelligence that allowed us to forecast that the war was impending. And in fact, I was one of those voices. I stood up in the White House press briefing room and at the State Department as well, and in fact told the media that we expected that there would be a full-scale invasion. And, was asked questions about when. And of course, it was difficult to say, but we did have a high degree of certainty that it was coming. And we took unprecedented steps to declassify the intelligence to be able to make that publicly available so that the world knew what Russia was about to do. In the early days after February 22nd, I think we were just dealing with the emergency situation as it evolved. And, you'll recall that in those immediate days and weeks prior to February 22nd, the Zelensky administration did not want to panic its population, and so was, in fact, downplaying the likelihood of a full-scale invasion, urging calm. I was, in fact, accused in some Ukrainian media of putting forward a hysterical narrative. And so they had to pivot very quickly, of course, to full-scale defense and to mobilizing the entire society. In those early days, we were worried just simply that Kyiv would collapse. And, there was a scenario where that could have happened. Fortunately, the fact that the Ukrainians had Javelin anti-tank missiles, that they were well organized, that the military responded quickly, and that, in fact, the entire society was mobilized in defense of the country, obviously helped them to push the Russians back from that initial assault on Kyiv. Subsequently, later in the year, so we're now talking about a very different phase of the war, sort of past the atrocities of Bucha and Irpin into the second half of 2022, there were, of course, fears of a possible nuclear escalation. I mean, I think it's fair to say that President Biden throughout the war was concerned about escalation and U.S. participation potentially in a conflict with a nuclear superpower, or a nuclear power, if you wish. Although in the strategic domain, Russia still remains a superpower. So yes, of course there were concerns. Those were most acute, however, in the back half of 2022.
Well, let's stick on that period then. There's, of course, been this big investigation piece done by the New York Times, widely discussed today. We were talking about it on the podcast yesterday, which alleges that the Russian front, of course, which was very close to collapse because of the counteroffensive, there was an opportunity for the Ukrainians to potentially break through and score a decisive blow, potentially. But for whatever reason, there were decisions made in the Ukrainian high command not to pursue that. Was there an understanding at the time in the White House that there was a prospect of a military victory for Ukraine, a decisive one, being capable of being achieved in that period? Or was the understanding always that this was going to be a likely long struggle that would end with some kind of negotiated conversation?
Well, I wasn't in the White House at the time in 2022. I was ambassador to the OSCE in Vienna. So I'm less able to answer your question precisely. I think there were different views on this matter, however, in Washington. I think there were a few folks who felt that potentially Ukrainian victory was possible. I think probably the weight of the room in the White House Situation Room favored a view that Ukraine could not possibly defeat Russia and that this was going to be a long, drawn-out war where we had to pace the levels of security assistance that we provided to Ukraine. So I don't think that there were many in the administration who felt that a flat out victory was possible. Of course, when you're talking about this period, this decisive period in 2022, when momentum was in Ukraine's favor, the provision at that point in time of additional security assistance could have allowed the Ukrainians to make some really bold steps, perhaps not in pushing the Russians completely out of their country, because I think Crimea would have been very difficult, but at least making very significant gains in Donetsk and Luhansk, not to mention Kherson and Zaporizhia, that would have put the front line of troops in a very different position from where it is today.
Were those, by your understanding, very fraught conversations in the Situation Room, or was there a collective feeling that the drip, drip, drip approach that was adopted was the right one at that time?
Well, again, hard for me to answer because I was only in some of those meetings as an ambassador overseas. I wasn't in all of them. What I would say is there were many who did not view it as drip, drip, drip. There were many in the room who thought that we were actually providing Ukraine with very significant, if not unprecedented levels of security assistance. And if you look at the numbers in terms of the dollar value of what we provided, that's a fair argument. I mean, I do agree that certain capabilities, certain crucial capabilities, had they been provided earlier, especially in the summer of 2022, could have made a decisive difference. And when I say decisive, I don't mean pushing the Russian military completely out of all of Ukraine, but allowing Ukrainians and the Ukrainian armed forces to really push back against the Russians and potentially encircle them in certain places and make very rapid gains in the east, in Donetsk and Luhansk, that, again, could have left us with a very different map today than what we have.
Well, if we look then at the counter-offensive and the preparations for it, of course, much, much touted at the time, and the expectations were extremely high. What's your understanding of the preparation that was given for the counter-offensive that took place, and where do you stand on the criticisms that were made that the United States and other allies like Britain were pushing for a strategy that was unlikely to work? Or do you put that charge more on the Ukrainians?
Well, I don't think it makes any sense to retrospectively play the blame game and try to point the finger at one or another side or one or another general who is formulating the strategy for the counteroffensive. Obviously, it wasn't successful. It also remains a very simple fact of warfare that counteroffensives are always more difficult than holding defensive lines. Takes a lot more folks. The Russians were very well dug in. They had minefields that were largely impenetrable. It was just a very, very difficult situation. The Ukrainians had remarkable success in some phases of this war. This is a phase of the war where they did not. I don't see the utility in pointing fingers. I don't even necessarily know where exactly the tactical errors were made. It's, military historians will look at this and will surely conclude that, some of the plans were perhaps overextended with regards to the various different axes, but let them pronounce on this. I think it was a valiant effort, and unfortunately it failed.
I wonder if you can comment, Ambassador, on President Biden's attitudes and mentality at this time, because, of course, there are lots of criticisms have been made about his health and the idea that he wasn't really making the big strategic decisions. Is that fair, or do you think history will show actually he was far more hands-on than we give him credit for?
Oh, no. Well, it's categorically false. I mean, the president was making all of the strategic decisions, and, I witnessed that myself. So that's an easy one to answer. He was asking a lot of questions of his advisors. He was carefully studying the situation on the battlefield, getting updates every day or almost every day. And he was making all the calls. At the end of the day, the buck stopped with him, for better or for worse, but he was making the calls.
Do you think, now that, of course, we've seen the end of the Biden administration, that there are many people that you've spoken to who were in power at that time, perhaps even yourself, who express regrets at decisions made? You allude there to the decision not to give certain weapons earlier in 2022? Or broadly, do you think people think we did as best we could with the decisions and with the information that we had at the time, and indeed with the options that we realistically had on the table?
Well, I won't comment on what other people think. What I think is that the Biden administration did a good job of getting an absolute ton, that's not an official term, but a ton of military equipment to Ukraine over the course of this war, and mobilized immense resources to be able to do that, and then also used the politics of the moment to be able to rally Congress in support of their aims. So by that score, I think the Biden administration did well. Where I would allow for a little bit of self-criticism is that if, again, to go back to what I said earlier, if certain key capabilities, say the long-range 300-kilometer variant ATACMS missile, had been given to Ukraine earlier in the war, if F-16s had been deployed earlier in the war, if the HIMARS system had been given to Ukraine earlier, I think that the Ukrainians could have made very good use of those capabilities. I don't buy the argument that, it was going to take this very extended period of time for them to learn how to use these sophisticated NATO interoperable systems. Clearly, they mastered them in relatively short order as it was. So it would have made sense to give these capabilities earlier in the war. That's my criticism of the previous administration. But let's also give credit where credit is due. Close to $70 billion with a B dollars worth of security assistance is more than any other country in the world. And at the end of the day, included all of these various capabilities that I just mentioned, as well as giving Ukrainians permission to use these capabilities across the border into Russia, which is a very, very big decision viewed by some as incredibly escalatory and dangerous at the time it was taken, but ultimately really benefited Ukraine.
Yes, that was going to be my next sort of moment, as it were. And I know you were involved in that decision. Can you talk about that time? Can you talk about the mood in the room and the argument that you put forward as to why you thought it was a necessary idea, given the threats at the time, to give those permissions?
Well, yeah, I don't want to personalize this. Let me just describe for you the context in which the decision was made. So as you'll recall, in the spring of 2024, the Russians had begun an offensive into Kharkiv Oblast and were in fact potentially going to threaten to take the city of Kharkiv, a huge city with many, many people, which would have had devastating consequences, not just in terms of that particular geography, but also in terms of overall morale and the trajectory of the war. And so we found ourselves in a situation where, as the Russians advanced slowly, they were able to position themselves on the northern side of the international border and effectively have sanctuary there to be able to strike at Ukrainian targets. And that was just a moral hazard that many of us couldn't countenance. And so there was a group of folks who strongly argued that we should allow the Ukrainians to strike back into Russian territory, never mind if that was some sort of red line, because clearly the Russians had broken that red line themselves. And so why not give the Ukrainians permission to counterattack and save the city of Kharkiv and push the Russians back? And that is a decision that floated its way up through the chain of command, so to speak, and eventually was put to the president, and the president approved. And so initially, using just HIMARS systems, artillery, we gave the Ukrainians the permission to be able to hit back into Russian territory. And then eventually that decision was extended to include the longer range ATACMS missile.
There are so many other moments that we could talk about. There's just one more that I'd like to talk about, which is Prigozhin's mutiny. What was the reaction to the Prigozhin mutiny at the time? And has there ever been, or was there ever, a moment that America thought Putin could actually be gone? And was that seen as something that could be a positive?
Well, I think initially when news of the mutiny reached Washington, the reaction was just simply one of shock that this was happening. and great uncertainty as to how this would turn out. Don't forget that it was a highly fluid situation. And had it not been for Alexander Lukashenko's intervention and his conversation with Prigozhin at a critical moment, convincing him to turn around, essentially, in his march on Moscow, he could have gotten a lot further, a lot closer to Moscow than I think many would have expected, because a lot of units that were defending the approaches to Moscow simply melted away. So it's unclear. I mean, a lot of folks will say in retrospect, it was completely impossible that he could have ever sacked Moscow. And I think that's probably true. I think that's highly unlikely. But he could have gone a lot further than he did. And why he, once he launched the mutiny, why he decided to turn around after just a matter of days remains a big mystery that I think psychologists will have to sort of look into and opine on in the future. But he did what he did. And of course, his fate was sealed at the moment that he turned back. The rest is history.
As I alluded to in your introduction, you're a Russia specialist, somebody very familiar with this region. Was there ever an attitude in the White House at that time to see Putin feel very domestically under pressure at home? Or was there always a fear, or a belief, should I say, that it's better the devil you know, and that we really don't want to see what might come next if we push too hard? I wonder what the nature, if any, of those conversations were.
I think there were some conversations around that theme for sure in the last administration. And there were some voices who were certainly very afraid of what might happen if the Putin regime were to crumble and how we would manage that situation. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of us realized that we had very little control over what happened inside Moscow or inside the Kremlin. And so rather than opine whether it was good or bad that events were taking a certain course, like the Prigozhin mutiny, for example, I think we were just simply trying to figure out how best to position ourselves, the United States, and how to react. I do think, generally speaking, when it comes to this war, though, I will say there is an underappreciation of what the Russian regime and what Russian occupation means for the territories where Russia controls people and resources. It's easy to look at this war sometimes and just sort of look at the map and the shifting lines and view it sort of antiseptically. I think the approach that I brought to the table, or the views that I articulated at the time, were centered on the human aspects of the war. And this is what I did at the OSCE when I was ambassador there, is really bring to light for the world and for the international media around the world the horrors of Russian occupation, the torture, the rape, the murder, the filtration camps, the abduction of children, the willful separation of families, the cruelty, the tragedies of Bucha and Irpin. Helping people in the United States and in other countries understand that we're not just talking about a war where, two countries are skirmishing over a sliver of territory somewhere near the Black Sea, but we're talking about really core European, core human values, the sanctity of the Geneva Conventions, for example, just the massive perpetration of war crimes and crimes against humanity and what that means for the future of our world. And so that's sort of a perspective that I think I brought to the conversation that you didn't always have. And sometimes, these conversations about what would happen to the Russian regime or what would happen on the battlefield were a little bit too academic in the sense of being removed from the human horrors of what's going on as we speak, in fact.
That's very interesting, and it's something, of course, we've been trying to draw attention to on the podcast now for 3 years, and so credit to you for speaking about this in the room where it matters. Why, given what you've just said, do you think President Biden seems so reluctant to talk about the war? There was never a huge speech, a never historic speech, where he tried to make the case to the American people, particularly in the latter half of his presidency, as to what was at stake. And some say that that left the door open to some of the Trump arguments, which, of course, we are now seeing play out in real time about this being a waste of American taxpayers' money, etc. I just wonder if you can comment on that.
Well, without wanting to sound disloyal to my former boss, I mean, I think it was a big mistake that didn't happen. And when I came back to Washington from the OSCE, I strongly advocated for an address to the nation from the Oval Office on Ukraine specifically, to lay out precisely what we've been talking about, to lay out the horrors of the war, why it was an imperative for the United States, both geopolitically but also morally, to help Ukraine defend itself. I made the case as best I could. I didn't make it once. I made it many times. It just wasn't taken up. So I think it was an unfortunate failure by the president's political team to push this, because that would have been the right time, say the spring or even before the spring. By then we were caught up in the Congress's failure to pass the supplemental assistance package. But even in 2023 and certainly in 2024, there was a very good rationale for having him address the nation.
That's fascinating. Well, let's turn to Europe then briefly, because, of course, we've seen over the last few weeks historic pronouncements made by President Trump, which have huge implications for the future of European security. I wonder, first of all, before we just get to the future of the US-Europe relationship, what was the attitude in the administration at the time towards Europe? Was there frustration at the apparent lack of mobilization and rearmament in response to Ukraine?
No, I think the attitude towards Europe was one of very, very strong partnership. The Biden administration came into office pledging to strengthen America's alliances and knit together our alliances in Europe with our alliances in the Indo-Pacific. And so we devised various innovative formats. I mean, we relied on what we called sort of variable geometry of allies to tackle various different problems. And, some European allies really stepped up to support Ukraine. Others sort of lagged in terms of the types of assistance that they were willing to provide. But it was a constant conversation. And so we devised new formats like the Ramstein format, what we officially call the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, to meet regularly and to hold our allies' feet to the fire in terms of pledges of support for Ukraine. And generally speaking, I think Europe underwent a profound change as a result of this war. I think it requires still further evolution. For example, take Germany. The Zeitenwende, the change in times that occurred under Chancellor Scholz, was a real phenomenon where Germany really stepped up the types of weapons that it provided to Ukraine. Could it have gone further? Of course, and it probably should have gone further. In fact, certainly so. But the allies were moving in the right direction. And rather than browbeating them, we were really encouraging them and having conversations about where we thought they needed to step up with very specific capabilities in support of Ukraine. So overall, I think it was a good partnership across the Atlantic. But of course, more could have been done.
Interesting. Well, it's one that's obviously become increasingly frosty now. So what do you think, and I know this is a very big question, perhaps we can break it down in a moment, but what do you think the future of the US-Europe relationship is? Because certainly from where we're sitting here, it feels like this is a new era now, that the bipartisan assumption in the United States that you would come to our aid is over, and that even if in a future administration there is more of a pivot to the way things were, it will no longer be something we can take for granted. But what's your perspective on the future of this, well, what many would see as vital relationship, whether it be relating to NATO or whether it be relating to just broadly the West? Because some people would say that the West now no longer exists following the pronouncements of President Trump.
Well, I think we are in a completely new era now. The post-Cold War era is over. It's gone. All of the relationships and institutions that we knew from the last 30 plus years are receding into the rearview mirror. And we're embarking on a brand new relationship between the two sides of the Atlantic. And I think it's very scary, and I think it's very unfortunate that this administration views Europe and certainly the EU as a strategic foe, to use a term that President Trump used in his first term, and to have this mentality that thinks that whatever the Europeans do is somehow out to get the United States. I think it will gradually decouple the United States from Europe, and that Putin will be the chief beneficiary of that. But Xi will also certainly be very happy to see that happening, and is in fact already taking advantage of it with various proposals to react against Trump tariffs with solidarity between China and European countries and other countries. So we're embarking on a brand new era in transatlantic relations that I think is quite dark. I hope this only lasts 4 years, and that in 4 years' time, we can get back to an alliance rooted in common values and democracy and freedom, and working together to tackle various global challenges. But I just worry that 4 years is a long time and a lot of damage can be done.
Do you think Article 5 still exists?
Well, I do, but Article 5, well, let me back up. Deterrence in general is always a marriage of political will and military capabilities. And so for now, the military capabilities exist to deter any aggressor that would threaten NATO territory. The United States still has overwhelming conventional force in Europe together with our allies, and that is sufficient just in terms of the capability piece of the equation. But when it comes to the political will, I mean, there are questions now about whether the Trump administration would be there for allies. And these questions go back to the first Trump term. There were comments that he made at the time about Montenegro, whether the U.S. would come to the defense of Montenegro. I think that was just an example that he picked out of thin air. But some of the statements that we've seen, and of course the Signalgate chat, revealed a deep-seated loathing, I think is the correct term, for European allies. That makes me very worried about the political will that backs up Article 5 and whether it's still there. I think it is, but it's in the hands of a new team of government officials that I don't know very well. And so I think it's a bit of an open question.
Well, let's look at the political will in Europe then. Of course, there are all these proposals now being put forward of a coalition of the willing, a reassurance force, a peacekeeping force in Ukraine were a ceasefire to happen. Even proposals from President Macron that they wouldn't ask permission of the Russians and they might move troops in to guarantee the security of Kyiv at some future date. What's your reaction to that? Because it does feel like quite a bold step, and I wonder whether that's something that was ever talked about as being a prospect of having US troops on the ground in Ukraine, or whether this is something that perhaps behind closed doors Europeans were talking about even during the Biden administration. Because it feels at the moment like a historic shift, but I'm interested in your perspective on that question.
Well, so we were talking about this because we were talking initially about trainers. You'll remember that President Macron first proposed trainers being sent to Ukraine. And look, I think this is a very useful conversation, but I think the focus should be elsewhere, at least initially, because the conversation about troops has been predicated on an American backstop. And I don't think that it's going to be there under the Trump administration, unfortunately. And so are NATO countries prepared to send troops into Ukraine in the absence of a ceasefire? Because surely Putin will never agree to a ceasefire if he thinks that NATO allies are going to deploy boots on the ground in Ukraine. So that's a question that needs to be answered. But I think in terms of where the focus ought to be, look, I think the European countries right now ought to very seriously think about seizing the principle of the Russian frozen assets that they have in their jurisdictions and using that to both provide an injection, a financial injection into Ukraine's defense industrial base, to allow the Ukrainians to produce the capabilities, especially the drones that have been so successful in degrading Russia's armed forces, and then perhaps strike some sort of a deal with the Trump administration to use some of that money to buy key American capabilities like Patriot air defense interceptors and the like. That, to me, is where the focus should be right now. If at some point in the future, European countries wanted to think about what they could do in Ukraine, I would suggest looking at some sort of an air shield over Western Ukraine as an initial foray by Western countries into Ukrainian territory. using Western pilots to provide sort of an air cap over, say, Lviv and as I said, parts of Western Ukraine, and allowing the Ukrainians and their pilots to really tend to the front lines. That, to me, is a more logical place to start than deploying forces right now. Because, as I said, if you deploy forces, then you perversely, you give Putin an incentive to accelerate the war and not to reach some sort of a ceasefire deal.
Ambassador, there's so many more subjects that we could talk about. I mean, it could be a 2-hour episode, but we are running out of time. So we always have the opportunity at the end of every episode for our guests to offer their final thoughts, an opportunity to talk about any subjects we may not have talked about that's on your mind that should be on ours. So over to you for your final thoughts. Anything you would like to talk to us about?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. I mean, look, I'll stay on subject. We've been talking about Ukraine, and I want to finish on Ukraine just by noting what I think is obvious to so many of your listeners, which is that this war is so critical to the future of the world. This is not just about Ukraine. It's not just about the post-Soviet periphery or Europe. It's really about the world. If the Trump administration, if other countries in East Asia are concerned about a cross-strait contingency in Taiwan with China, they have to care about the Ukraine war. And policies that I see playing out in front of our eyes today are, I think, very short-sighted. And some of the China hawks in this administration who think that we should just simply cauterize this war and move on and redeploy assets to the Indo-Pacific to deal with the pacing threat of China are really strategically myopic and will regret those decisions in the future. I hope we can stand with Ukraine because it really is about the future of the world that we live in.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.